looking at today is grasslands, deserts, and early human activity, as well as early settled human civilizations. And we're going to find very quickly that humans settled near deserts because near deserts are grasslands. Grasslands are transition ecosystems between deserts and forests, and they don't come naturally. They're not a climactic vegetation, meaning they're not like the apex of plants. The reason this is so is because grass, their roots can only go so far into the soil, which means after a few generations of grass, they deplete the soil at the surface level. And this is why trees do better than grass in long term timescales, because trees can go further into the soil, they can break through clay, they can break through concrete, they can get through and access the minerals that grass depletes very quickly. Now, obviously, grass grows in all the niches that trees don't necessarily or aren't necessarily able to grow in. So, your prairies, your steppe, and your savanna, they only grow because they have been altered by man made forces. Grass is, in a lot of senses of the word, nomadic. It grows in some area and it spreads where it can. If it's contained for a long period of time in a large system, a large region or geographic area, it will turn into a desert or a forest. And it's only going to turn into a desert if no forest is allowed to grow. So, the regions of the earth where we have large deserts, adjacent to them, we have grasslands. These deserts, they used to be grasslands. Early human civilizations that settled, agricultural civilizations, they settled near these deserts where you had grasslands. Why? Because it's a flat plain that allows you to grow a lot of crops. So farmland and grassland are temporary. They're not sustainable because they deplete the soil of nutrients, and they only can go so far and penetrate so deep into the soil levels. This means if you wanted to track early human activity, deserts are an indication of where large groups of humans lived for a long period of time, and they destroyed the forests there. Humans will typically live around coasts, so whether it's the ocean, lakes, seas, rivers, or forests. So when we look at the history of humans, so going back at least to Homo erectus about 2 million years ago, those were the first fire wielding humans that used it on a large scale. There is some evidence that humans like Australopithecus used fire or had some level of fire control, but Homo erectus is the main human group that mastered fire and used it on a large scale. About 2 million years ago, Earth was in glacial periods. And so the Earth was very cold. How do you warm up? You use fire. About 1.2 million years ago, there was a significant spike in temperature and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide levels is what indicates the level of temperature. And 1.2 million years ago, there was a huge spike in temperature because Homo erectus was burning large regions of the Earth. I'm going to go more in depth into that in the second edition of my magazine Exoterica. Obviously, I'm still working on the first edition. I'm ironing out the details and the finalizing it. But I already know what the second edition. I've already brainstormed the second edition. So I'll go more into fire economies. It's going to be about sun and fire mythology and lore, as well as fire economies and early use of fire and how that changed the world. But today we're looking at one aspect of that, which is the creation of deserts, grasslands. And that's where we have early settled human civilization. So there's a few deserts in South America, North America, Africa, Australia, and Asia. This is where you would have had large amounts of humans, whether it was Homo erectus, whether it was Neanderthals, whether it was Homo sapiens. I don't think it really matters. At least in the last 100,000 years, maybe as far back as a million years, is when most of these deserts formed. And they formed because of continued burnings, the use of fire to burn forests. About 2 million years ago, most of the earth was lush forests, and that started to change when human groups were using fire as their main access to resources to control the environment for warmth, for food acquisition, resource acquisition, to drive off predators. They would burn entire regions of the forest ground that they lived in, that the earth was covered in. This released carbon dioxide and started to raise the temperatures. It's plausible that humans had a role in ending the ice ages or changing how the ice ages were working by completely transforming a lot of the topography of the world as far back as 1 million or 1.2 million years ago, and certainly as recently as 100,000 years ago at increased rates or increased intervals. Grassland is going to turn into a desert because desertification happens when there's nothing to retain moisture in the soil, nothing to block out the sun from the soil. So the topsoil is loose and it becomes arid because it can't contain moisture. And this creates a feedback loop that continues this process of being arid. And so then you have no moisture, so nothing can grow, and the soil is loose, so it blows around. And then you have deserts that start to form. Now, there may have been some smaller deserts 2 million years ago, but they certainly weren't the deserts that we see today. They were much smaller. Deserts would naturally form under very extreme pressures. So maybe volcanoes or meteorites or even an ice age could cause a desert. But the majority of the Earth was not a desert 2 million years ago, probably not even 1 million years ago, until groups like Homo erectus started to use burnings. This destroys the forests, and maybe the forests grow back, but continued burnings, you start to have grass that grows because it's faster, it's quicker, and it is pretty durable and robust, but it is a short term vegetation. It's not a climactic vegetation. It's not suitable for long term. So, what that means is that grasslands and farmland and crops, those don't last a long time because they deplete the minerals of the soil. And then this would eventually lead to desertification if trees aren't allowed to grow. So, when we look at the grasslands today, they are all around the deserts because the deserts used to be grasslands. And when we take a look at early settled human civilizations, they're all around these regions that were grasslands. Why would you settle around grasslands? Because you can grow a lot of crops there. It's fertile land, not long term, it won't be fertile for thousands and thousands of years the way the forests are, but it's fertile ground that you can plant crops and so you can sustain a settled human population. But deserts are going to keep growing when you keep farming and you keep creating a sort of fake climactic vegetation because you're forcing the crops to grow there. Of course, if you have crops growing there and grass growing there, you're going to have a lot of livestock. This would allow settled humans to exist in these grassland regions. There's a few things to note or point out. Homo erectus caused more climate change than humans today. And I don't want to get too much into global warming. You guys will probably not agree with me on this, but um, humans, of course, do have an effect on global warming, and mostly through the topography of the land that we alter. Homo erectus did this, or humans in general have been doing this for the last 2 million years. So, yeah, we do have an effect on the global climate because of our effect on other parts of the ecosystem. But the amount of change that happened from 1.2 million years ago was way more significant than what we've done today. Now, if we continue doing what we do with the vast amounts of farmland, we're going to continue that process of desertification, which is going to increase the global temperature. Why? Because the atmospheric circulation, the heat, the moisture, all of those are going to change the total landscape, the biosphere. The reason I bring that up is because of a couple of reasons. One, deserts are easy to remediate, and grasslands are going to become deserts. And if you wanted to stop desertification, you need to stop grasslands from existing. They're not a natural climactic vegetation because they're not sustainable for long term periods. So you would want to reforest grasslands and you want to grow grasslands where you have deserts, which would make sense because grass is so much easier to grow short term than trees. And it's because they're a short term sort of placeholder ecosystem, you could then plant trees after enough grass has grown and kind of help to retain moisture and start to rebuild the soil and the web of life that would be within a region that contributes to fertility of the soil, fertilizer, corpses, and other organic material that you need to start cultivating land for forest growth. Or the assumptions of paleontology and biology is basically only when humans started writing did humans exist. And this is obviously problematic for a few reasons. We over obsess with genetics and this idea of humans. If you had a Homo erectus and a Neanderthal person in the room with you, you really wouldn't call them human. That seems disingenuous. We're too attached to this idea of one kind of human. Humans for the last 2 million years have been altering the face of the earth. And it tells us two things. One, these things are reversible, they're easily fixable. If you wanted to stop the spread of deserts, you would add grasslands. You would create grasslands. If you wanted to then change those grasslands into forests, you would do that. Farming in the same place over and over again is not sustainable. It will create a desert, maybe in 50 years, maybe in 100 years, maybe in 1,000 years, but it will become a desert if no forest is allowed to grow. You need these larger organisms because they retain more moisture, they access deeper parts of the soil, which means you can build an entire ecosystem, and that contributes to the total weather of the biosphere. The problem I have with global warming today is it's seen as this inevitable cause through emissions and not through what we do to the topography of the lands, what we do to the different ecosystems. The more grasslands we create, the more potential regions are going to be deserts, and this is only going to cause the decline of moisture and blocking out wind movements. And so we're going to have more things like the Dust Bowl and um, hotter climates and stuff like that. It's completely reversible, and it's a solution that's not some abstract emissions based problem. It's purely based off of how we're managing the land. We also have to understand that 2 million years ago, the Earth was very cold. It was in a glacial period. Homo erectus was burning wood to warm it up, to warm themselves up, and to access resources that they didn't have an easy time accessing without fire, without the use and employ of fire as a destructive force. But early settled human civilizations, they they sprang up around grasslands where before them there was large amounts of human activity burning these different forest regions, which became grasslands because they were burned too constantly and too consistently for forests to grow. You do that enough times, you eventually have deserts that start to grow and spread. And you have human civilization settling in these different grasslands because it's suitable terrain for a sedentary type of human, which is again only a short term solution. Humans, at the very least, are supposed to be semi nomadic because anything that you try to maintain in one single spot for long periods of time, you're going to overwork the earth and you're going to create a desert. So our farmland should move periodically, and in place of that old farmland should be forests to reconstitute that soil in that region. But we're not going to do that, or we haven't been doing that. We're going to keep over farming the single areas that we have, and then we're going to wonder why they're deserts, and then we're going to move on to the forests that still exist and turn those into grasslands, and then turn those into farmland, and then they're going to become deserts again. Meanwhile, our deserts should be reconstituted as grasslands. If we're looking at human activity across the last 2 million years, we need to look towards the desert. That's going to give us a better indication of human activity than finding artifacts. For example, North and South America, the consensus is about 12 to 15,000 years ago is when humans made it to North and South America. However, the actual ecological effects indicate at least 100 to 300,000 years ago. Again, whether that was Homo erectus, Neanderthals, or whatever. I don't think it matters. I don't view any of them less human. As they're saying, we obsess over this idea of humans and then we keep qualifying humans at certain levels where, well, only modern humans started writing. Of course, we had civilizations like the Scythians who didn't have any writing that were destroying other cultures for hundreds of years. They were a terror. And what you're just going to say, those aren't real humans, seems ridiculous and disingenuous. The ability to write is not an indication of your humanness. Another thing to note, if humans didn't have fully settled civilizations, such as in North America, where you had a lot more semi nomadic peoples living there, likely for the last 1 to 300,000 years, they're going to be using, up until recent times, obviously, a lot of the same locations and places that you would normally find artifacts in areas that have become too much of deserts, right? Because we look for hearths and stone tools for ancient use. But if those areas of living were used and constantly updated and taken advantage of, you wouldn't find artifacts 100,000 years ago because people as far back as 1,000 years ago were still using them or still using those areas. So you wouldn't expect to find ancient artifacts in North and South America as easily as in other parts of the world that had changing civilizations and whatnot. So the better indication is whether you're seeing large deserts. If you're seeing large deserts, there were humans there at least 100,000 years ago, sometimes as far back as 1,000,000 years ago. Again, I'm not attached to the idea of genetics and being like, okay, only certain kinds of humans are capable of anything. Right? We wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for the bacteria, the algae, and the diatoms and the fungus creating an atmosphere in the first place. So we obsess over this idea of humans, especially in paleontology and biology, right? Humans just sort of spawned in randomly some few thousand years ago BC, and the state of the world is just what it is because that's how it was trending for the last billion years, and only time started when humans became aware of it. That's the kind of language these scientists and paleontologists and biologists and evolutionaries use, when indeed humans for the last 2 million years have been changing the face of the earth. And of course, all of life contributes to this in some way. But we consider only modern human activity as being relevant to what humans have done. So if we look at grasslands, we know that there was humans there because they burned down forests. And if we look at deserts, we know those used to be grasslands. And we know grasslands are not a climactic vegetation, which means they used to be forests. So a more accurate map of human activity would be these hotspots of desert regions. This is where large populations of humans, likely semi-nomadic, were creating these bushfires over and over again over the span of a few 100,000 years to as far back as 1,000,000 years. Further back you go, like 1,000,000 years is probably mainly Africa and the Middle East and maybe parts of Asia, but at least 100,000 years ago for areas like Australia, South America, and North America. Again, I don't really care what kind of hominid species it was. They're all humans. They're all people. They're all persons. None of them are any less or more capable than the others. Maybe they have different specializations, but we obsess over the idea of Homo sapiens, which makes sense. We want to feel like we're special. We want to feel that we're something more than animals. But we are. We are mammals. And we learned how to control fire and we changed the face of the earth. When I'm reading modern studies into these things, a lot of it is so defeatist. It's so like paradoxical. They'll say that humans are these great transcended creatures and we have no ability to positively affect things. We only talk about what is negatively being done to the earth. The amount of damage that we've done to ecosystems is paled in comparison to 1.2 million years ago with Homo erectus. The deserts that we came conscious to when we suddenly became some transcended species is there because for the last 1.5 years, there were other humans there doing what they needed to survive. And if we continue on this course, we will warm up the earth more and we will create more deserts. But it's because we're creating deserts that warms up the earth, not some abstract quality of just existing. You're suddenly doing that. It's because of what we're doing to the topography of these land masses, the deforestation, the farmland, and then the desertification. Humans control things with bushfires for hundreds of thousands of years and benefited, and they knew um, the different cultures around these grasslands knew how to contain the grasslands and stop them from becoming deserts. If you look at the Aboriginal Australian practices of maintaining these bushfires and controlling them, this contributed to the overall productivity of Australia as a ecological system. Without that, we don't really know what we're doing because we don't view grassland as a temporary thing. We think it's a climactic vegetation when it's not a climactic vegetation. It's going to turn into a desert. And we aren't doing anything to help that or control it. And that's what's going to cause more issues with climate. More wind systems can get through, more weather systems can get through. There's going to be less rainfall in those areas. And this is going to happen with farmland because crops are essentially the same thing. They're not able to sustain long term because of how they interact with the soil. Main takeaways with this that I wanted to point out was how deserts can be used as indications of very early human activity, at least as far back as 100,000 years. Some of these deserts were created 20,000 years ago, some of them maybe a million years ago. And some deserts may have been much smaller from 50 million years ago. But the reason why they are the way they are now is because everything around them was burned. And it was continuously burned to exploit those resources over the course of many, many hundreds of thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. Because you had grasslands in this transitional state from forest to grassland to desert, you had terrain you could use to grow crops. You could have livestock and you could have settled humans with consistent resource acquisition through agriculture. And it coincides with where the deserts are because where the deserts are, you have grassland surrounding that. Where you have grassland, you had the major civilizations that were settled spring up. But if you wanted to find even further ancient human activity, you would look in the deserts because that's where they would have burned things down and they would have acquired those resources and lived in those areas in likely semi-nomadic or fully nomadic lifestyles that circulated around the regions you have deserts. The deserts exist because humans burned them time and time again, especially in the much colder glacial periods that humans sort of lived in as far back as 2 million years ago, maybe as far back as 4 million years ago with Australopithecus, but Homo erectus was the main humans that seemed to be using fire on a wide scale, large scale, consistent basis, and then Neanderthals and other hominid groups progressively getting more and more use of fire until agriculture when fire was less used. But then you had the results of that fire, that change in the topography, that those changes in the ecosystems allowed for them to settle into agricultural civilizations. But it was because of the previous million years of human fire economies that allowed for this terrain to be used as farmland. And if we continue on that trend, we will create more deserts. Or we could take the opportunity and grow grasslands and then let them grow back into forests. Grasslands are never going to beat forests because they're not a climactic vegetation. They will exhaust the soil in a way that trees don't, just because trees can reach deeper into the soil. Again, grassland's going to fill any niche that trees don't, but in terms of these large geographic areas, trees are going to win out in the long term. And grass is there as a transition vegetation, same with crops, for forests. or deserts if we allow the desertification process to continue, which is that feedback loop of more dryness and more loose soil becoming more arid because there's less moisture that's contained in the soil, because there's less things creating moisture. There's less of that ecosystem, spores and bacteria and pollen that creates the water or the nucleation of water necessary for rainfall. And so you have deserts that are created because of overexploitation or overuse of fire or overuse of farmland. That is, I think, all I wanted to talk about in this video. So thanks for watching and peace out.